They say a man's last words tell you everything about who he really was. But what if his last words weren't spoken? What if they were written? What if the truth he carried to the gallows was folded up in a single yellowed envelope, sealed with blood, hidden beneath a floorboard, and not found until 20 years too late? This is the story of Eli Cross, Cowboy, Outlaw. Executed by hanging in the town of Redrock Flats, New Mexico, on the 14th of September 1879. A man the town called a killer. A man the law called guilty. A man who left behind one letter, and in that letter, everything the town of Redrock Flats wanted buried forever. And when that letter was finally found, nothing was ever the same again. Picture the town of Redrock Flats on the morning of September 14th. The sun hadn't cleared the mesa yet. The sky was bruised, purple and orange, like something had bled out across the horizon. Dust devils spun lazy circles through the main street. The saloon was quiet for once. Even the horses tied to the posts seemed still, waiting, as if they knew what was coming. They were building the gallows 2 weeks before. Everyone watched from their porches and said nothing. The carpenter, old Hector Dunn, worked without speaking. 3 times he measured the drop. 3 times he checked the beam. They say he went home that night and didn't eat. His wife said he sat at the kitchen table for an hour just staring at his hands. By 7 in the morning, the whole town had gathered. Men in dusty coats. Women clutching the hands of their children. Some had ridden in from neighboring towns just to see it. Just to watch a man die. Sheriff Dale Mercer walked up the steps first. He was a big man. Broad-shouldered. Silver badge catching the early light. He had a face that had never once looked uncertain. At least that's what people believed. That morning, one woman who stood close said she noticed his left hand was trembling slightly. She didn't think much of it at the time. They brought Eli Cross out in chains. Now let me tell you something about Eli Cross. He wasn't what you'd expect. He wasn't some wild-eyed desperado. He was 34 years old. Lean but not wiry. Brown eyes that people said were the kind that looked right through you. Calm, quiet, like still water over deep stone. He walked with his chin up. No stumbling. No crying. He looked out at the crowd that had gathered to watch him die, and he didn't show them anger. He didn't show them fear. He showed them something worse. He showed them sadness. Like a man who had already made peace with the world, and was simply disappointed in it. The charges were read aloud. Murder in the first degree. The killing of Thomas Aldridge, landowner. Shot twice in the back on the night of August 3rd. Eli Cross said nothing when the charges were read. They asked him if he had any last words. He looked out at the crowd, and then he looked directly at Sheriff Dale Mercer. Just for a moment. One long, quiet second that several witnesses would later describe as deeply unsettling. Then Eli Cross said 3 words. Read the letter. Nobody knew what that meant. The crowd murmured. Sheriff Mercer's jaw tightened. One witness said the color left the sheriff's face, just for a flash. Like a lamp being turned down. The hood went over Eli's head. The rope was placed. And at exactly 7:42 in the morning, on the 14th of September 1879, Eli Cross was hanged by the neck until he was dead. The crowd dispersed. The dust settled. The body was cut down and buried at the edge of town with no marker, no ceremony. Sheriff Mercer went back to his office. The saloon opened early. And the letter. The letter sat hidden beneath a floorboard in cell number 3 of the Redrock Flats jailhouse. For 20 years. 2 decades of dust, of silence, of secrets packed in tight around it. Until the day a young deputy named Samuel Cole dropped his keys and knelt down to find them, and heard something hollow beneath the old rotted wood beneath his boots. Samuel Cole was 22 years old. Born right here in Redrock Flats the year after Eli Cross was executed. He had never heard much about the hanging. Small towns have long memories for some things and very short ones for others. The execution of Eli Cross was a story people didn't much tell anymore. Samuel pried up the floorboard with his pocket knife. The envelope beneath it was wrapped in an old piece of leather, tied with a thin strip of rawhide. On the outside, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who didn't write often but wrote with intention, were 5 words. For whoever comes after truth. Samuel Cole sat down on the floor of that jail cell and opened it. Inside were 4 pages of yellowed paper, covered front and back in that same careful hand. Ink faded but still legible. Smelling of dust and time and something else, something iron-sharp that Samuel would later describe as the smell of old blood. He began to read. My name is Eli James Cross. I am writing this letter in cell number 3 of the Redrock Flats jailhouse on the night before they intend to hang me. I have no lawyer who will listen. I have no judge who will look me in the eye. So I am writing this for the only judge left, whoever finds these words after I am gone. I did not kill Thomas Aldrich. I know that is what every condemned man says. I know it means nothing to say it and perhaps nothing to write it. But here is what I know. Here is what I saw. Here is why I am going to the rope with the truth still locked inside me, because the man who actually pulled that trigger is the same man who holds the key to my cell. Samuel Cole's hands began to shake. Sheriff Dale Mercer killed Thomas Aldrich. I saw it with my own eyes on the night of August 3rd. I had ridden out to the Aldrich land to return a horse I had borrowed from Thomas 3 weeks prior. We had an arrangement, Thomas and I, for grazing rights. The night was clear. Full moon. I came over the ridge and I saw 2 men below me on the flat. I recognized Thomas by his coat, the red one he always wore, the one his wife sewed the brass buttons on. The other man had his back to me. He was tall, broad, silver catching the moonlight on his chest. He shot Thomas Aldrich twice in the back without a word. Thomas fell without a sound, or maybe I just couldn't hear it from where I was. I froze. I couldn't move. And then the man turned and looked up toward the ridge. Not at me, I don't think he saw me, but I saw his face clear as daylight in that moon. It was Sheriff Dale Mercer. Samuel Cole had to stop reading. He pressed his back against the cold jail wall and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Dale Mercer had been sheriff for 32 years. He had built half the law in this county. There was a portrait of him hanging in the courthouse. He had been given a commendation by the territorial governor. He had just attended his granddaughter's christening last Sunday. And according to this letter, he was a murderer. And he had let an innocent man hang. Samuel picked up the letter again. I rode hard back to town. I told myself I would go to the sheriff, and then I remembered. Dale Mercer was the sheriff. I thought of going to the circuit judge, but the circuit judge and Mercer had been friends since before I was born. I had no money for a lawyer. I was a drifter. A cowboy. A man with no deed to his name and no family nearby. Who would believe me? 3 days later, Mercer arrested me for the murder. He had a witness. A man named Roy Pickle, who ran the stable, who said he saw me riding out toward the Aldrich land that night with a revolver on my hip. That much was true. I did ride out that night and I did carry a gun because every man in this territory carries a gun. But Roy Pickle said something else. Roy Pickle said he heard me say, and I quote, "Thomas Aldrich has got the last of what's coming to him." I never said those words. I have never spoken to Roy Pickle in my life more than a how do you do. But Roy Pickle owed Sheriff Mercer 3 months of back rent on that stable. And Roy Pickle had a wife and 4 children he couldn't afford to lose. I understand why he lied. I'm not angry at Roy Pickle. Fear makes cowards of the best of us. Samuel Cole read on. His supper sat cold and forgotten outside the cell door. Now you might be wondering why. Why would Dale Mercer want Thomas Aldrich dead? They were not enemies by reputation. Mercer had served as sheriff during all the years Thomas had run his cattle operation. They were seen together often. They appeared to be friends. But here is what the town did not know. What I did not know either until Thomas told me himself over whiskey, 3 weeks before he died. Thomas Aldrich had discovered something. Samuel leaned closer to the page. For 11 years, from 1865 to 1876, Dale Mercer had been skimming from the county land registry. Every time a claim was filed, every time a deed was transferred, every time the territory collected its tax on property, Mercer took a cut. Small amounts. $5 here. 10 there. Sometimes 20. It never looked like much on its own. But over 11 years, it amounted to nearly $14,000. Thomas Aldrich had found the original ledger books. He had a cousin who worked as a clerk in Santa Fe, and when the territorial government began an audit of county funds in the summer of 1879, his cousin flagged the discrepancies and sent Thomas the figures. Thomas came to Mercer privately first. He said he wanted to give the man a chance to make it right. To come clean. To repay what he had taken. What Thomas didn't understand, what he couldn't have known, was that Dale Mercer had no intention of making anything right. Dale Mercer had spent 30 years building himself into the most powerful man in this county. He wasn't going to let a ledger book and a cattle rancher take that away. 3 nights after Thomas came to him, Thomas Aldrich was dead. And I was under arrest. There is one more thing I must tell you. Something I have debated writing because it concerns an innocent party who has suffered enough. But I have decided that the truth requires it. Samuel turned to the 3rd page. Mercer did not act alone. He had help in the cover-up. Not in the killing, I believe that was Mercer alone. But in building the case against me. In coaching Roy Pickle. In making sure the circuit judge received a report before he arrived in town that painted me as a dangerous drifter with a grudge. That help came from Deputy Frank Hobbs. Samuel's blood ran cold. Frank Hobbs was his boss. Frank Hobbs was the man who had pinned a deputy's badge to Samuel's chest 8 months ago. Frank Hobbs, who had a wife and a daughter who went to church every Sunday, who had taught Samuel how to track a man through desert rock. Frank Hobbs was not acting out of malice, the letter continued. I believe he was afraid. Mercer held something over him, I do not know what. But I watched from the window of this cell, as Mercer and Hobbs met on the street outside the jailhouse on the night of my sentencing. I could not hear the words, but I saw Frank Hobbs weeping. And I saw Mercer place a hand on his shoulder, not in comfort, in warning. Here is something you need to understand about what Samuel Cole was holding in his hands. This wasn't just a letter. This was a confession, a testimony, a complete account of a crime, written by the only witness who had also been its victim. And it had been sitting here for 20 years. Through 2 more sheriffs after Mercer retired. Through the deaths of Thomas Aldridge's wife and children, who had carried the grief of an unsolved killing for 2 decades. Through the natural deaths of Roy Pickle and Frank Hobbs, both gone to their graves with their secrets intact. Dale Mercer himself was still alive. 71 years old. He lived in a fine house on the north end of town. He sat on the city council. People called him Mr. Mercer now, or sometimes Old Dale. He was considered a founding father of sorts. A pillar. Samuel read the final page of the letter. I do not know if this will ever be found. I do not know if it matters to anyone living whether Eli Cross was guilty or innocent. Maybe by the time these words are read, everyone involved will be dead and buried and beyond any earthly accounting. But I am writing this because I believe in something that Dale Mercer does not. I believe the truth matters even when it changes nothing practical. I believe a man's name matters. I believe that my mother, wherever she is, deserves to know that her son was not a murderer. I believe that if I say nothing, then the silence becomes its own kind of sin. And so I say this, I, Eli James Cross, am innocent. I have never killed a man. I have never wished to. The rope they put around my neck belongs to someone else, and that someone else is sleeping in a warm bed tonight while I write this by candlelight. I am not angry. I am past anger. What I feel at the end of all this is something I did not expect. I feel sorry for Dale Mercer. Not because of what is coming for him in this world or the next. That is not my business. I feel sorry for him because he will have to live with this. He will have to keep waking up every morning and looking in the mirror at a man who sent an innocent person to the gallows. He will have to carry that for however many years he has left. And I genuinely think, that is a heavier punishment than any judge could give. Be well. Be honest. Be brave enough to tell the truth when it costs you something. Eli James Cross. September 13, 1879. Samuel Cole sat in that cell for a long time after he finished reading. It was dark outside now. The oil lamp on the desk flickered. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing guitar in the saloon. A slow, melancholy tune that drifted through the dry night air like smoke. He thought about what to do. The practical part of his mind told him to think carefully. Mercer had friends everywhere. The current sheriff, a man named Wallace who had served under Mercer, might not believe the letter. Or worse, might believe it and choose to do nothing. The letter was old. The witnesses were dead. There was no physical evidence beyond the words of a condemned man who had every reason to claim innocence. But then Samuel thought about what Eli Cross had written at the end. Be brave enough to tell the truth when it costs you something. He put the letter in his coat pocket and walked out of the jailhouse. He walked past the saloon, past the blacksmith, past the church with its single lamp burning yellow in the window. He walked to the north end of town where the houses were bigger and the fences were white, and he knocked on the door of the fine house where Dale Mercer lived. A housekeeper answered. Samuel asked to see Mr. Mercer. There was a pause. Then an old man appeared in the doorway. Dale Mercer at 71 was still tall. Still broad in the shoulders, though they rounded now with age. His hair was white. His face was deeply lined. His eyes, still sharp, still watchful, moved over Samuel with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent 40 years reading other men for signs of threat. Deputy Cole, he said. His voice was still deep. What brings you out this late? Samuel said nothing for a moment. He reached into his coat and brought out the letter, still in its leather wrapping. And something extraordinary happened. Dale Mercer looked at that letter, that old leather bundle, and the color drained from his face completely. Not gradually. All at once. Like a tide going out. He knew. He recognized it. After 20 years he still knew what it was. Which meant he had known about it. All along. He had known Eli Cross had left a letter. He had searched for it. Maybe he had even gone back to that jail cell and looked for it, and somehow, by luck or fate or the particular mercy of old floorboards, he had missed it. 20 years of knowing there might be a letter out there. 20 years of wondering. Of waking in the night. "You might want to sit down, Mr. Mercer," Samuel said quietly. They sat in Mercer's parlor. The housekeeper was sent away. The fire burned low. Samuel placed the letter on the table between them. For a long moment, Dale Mercer simply looked at it. He did not reach for it. He did not speak. The fire crackled. Outside, a coyote called once and went quiet. Then Dale Mercer said something that Samuel Cole would repeat for the rest of his life, and that would appear years later in the newspaper account when the full story finally broke. He said, "I've been waiting for that thing to show up for 20 years. Part of me hoped it would. Part of me hoped it wouldn't." Samuel stared at him. "He was telling the truth," Mercer said, flatly, without any inflection, as if he was commenting on the weather. Eli Cross was telling the truth about all of it. And then the old man did something Samuel had not expected. He leaned forward. He pressed both hands flat on the table. And he began to talk. He talked for nearly 2 hours. He talked about Thomas Aldridge and the ledger books just as Eli had described. He talked about the night of the shooting, the moon, the flat ground, the way Thomas had turned at the last second as if he'd heard something, and how Mercer had been afraid he'd seen his face so he fired again. He talked about Roy Pickle and the lies and Frank Hobbs and what Mercer had held over him. A past crime, a theft from a previous employer that Hobbs had confessed to Mercer in confidence, that Mercer had turned into a chain. He talked about the morning of the hanging. About standing there in his silver badge watching Eli Cross walk to the gallows with that quiet, sad dignity. About how Eli had looked at him at the end, that long level look, and Mercer had made himself hold it. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself Eli was nobody, a drifter, a man the world wouldn't miss. But the look in his eyes, Mercer said. His voice had dropped to nearly nothing. 20 years and I still see that look when I close mine at night. He didn't look at me like he hated me. He looked at me like he pitied me. Like he already knew what the rest of my life was going to feel like. He looked up at Samuel. And he was right, the old man said. Every single day he was right. Samuel Cole went home that night with the letter and with 2 hours of testimony that he had written down, word for word, in his notebook. He went to the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe. He went to the new circuit judge, a younger man appointed only 3 years prior, who had no connection to Mercer's network. He sent copies of the letter by post to the governor's office. The story broke 6 weeks later. Dale Mercer was formally charged in November of 1899. The case was complicated by the age of the evidence and the deaths of most witnesses, but Mercer's own recorded confession, given willingly, almost eagerly, to Samuel Cole on that October night, was enough. He pled guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in the territorial penitentiary 11 months later, at the age of 72, in a small cell with a single window. Some people said justice was served. Others said it was 20 years too late to call it justice. A headstone was placed at the edge of Redrock Flats for Eli Cross. Samuel Cole paid for it himself. Read. Eli James Cross. 1845 to 1879. Innocent. He told the truth. We did not listen. But here is the part of the story that nobody talks about. The part that gets left out of the newspaper accounts. When Samuel Cole was sorting through the evidence he had collected, the letter, his notes, the copies he had made, he found something tucked inside the original leather wrapping that he had missed the first time. Behind the 4 pages of Eli's letter, folded smaller, a different paper. Different handwriting. Shakier. More hurried. He unfolded it. It was a note. Undated. Read. If you are reading this and Eli's letter is with it, then you already know what Dale Mercer is. I put this note here because I want you to know one other thing. Eli Cross saved my life once. 3 years before all this, on the trail north of the Sangre de Cristos, I was thrown from my horse and broke my leg in 2 places. Eli Cross found me. He built a fire and stayed with me through 2 nights of fever. He rode 2 days to get me help. He never told anyone. He never asked for anything in return. He was the finest man I have ever known. And I let them hang him. I was afraid and I let them hang the finest man I have ever known. There is no words in any language for what I am. God help me. Roy Pickle, March 1882. Roy Pickle had found Eli's hiding place. Had read the letter. Had known the truth for 17 years before he died. And he had added his own confession to it, wrapped it back up and put it back under the floorboard. He hadn't told anyone. He had just added his guilt to Eli's truth and left them both in the dark. Here is what I want you to think about when this story is over. Eli Cross walked to the gallows knowing he was innocent, knowing who was really guilty, knowing that the system that was supposed to protect him had been turned into a weapon against him. He could have screamed. He could have fought. He could have named Dale Mercer publicly from the scaffold in front of the whole town. He didn't. He said 3 words. Read the letter. And then he trusted the truth to find its own way home. That took more courage than anything I can imagine. More than drawing a gun. More than throwing a punch. More than any of the things we call bravery in the story of the Old West. And Roy Pickle, that frightened, guilt-ridden man who lived for 17 years with what he had done. He added his guilt to the record. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't undo it. But he couldn't let the truth exist without his confession beside it. As if his shame needed a witness the same way Eli's innocence did. There's something almost unbearable in that. And Dale Mercer, a man who spent 30 years building a monument to himself, and then spent the next 20 watching it from the inside, knowing the whole thing was built on the bones of an innocent man. He said Eli was right. That every day since the hanging Eli had been right. That's not a prison cell that breaks a man. That's a conscience. The letter Eli Cross wrote in the candlelight of cell number 3 on the last night of his life was found 20 years after his execution. It brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory. It restored his name. It set the record straight. But it didn't bring him back. Nothing does that. The gallows in Redrock Flats were torn down in 1901. The wood was used to build a fence around the town cemetery. Whether that was irony or justice or just coincidence, I'll let you decide. The headstone for Eli Cross still stands, they say. At the edge of that dry, sun-hammered cemetery, where the desert pushes up against the edge of civilization and the wind comes through in the late afternoon like a long, slow exhale. On quiet days, when the dust settles and the sky goes wide and amber over the mesa, you can almost imagine him there, walking out of the sunset, unhurried, unbothered. A man with nothing left to prove and no one left to answer to. A man who told the truth, and trusted it to outlast everything that tried to bury it.